Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hey, good afternoon to everyone joining us online and to our in-person audience here on Rhode Island Avenue in Washington, D.C. My name is Jake Harrington. I'm the Intelligence Fellow in the International Security Program here at CSIS, and it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome the Honorable Michael Vickers for a conversation about the future of intelligence. I want to extend my sincere thanks to you, Dr. Vickers, for making the time to join us today for this really important discussion. And I also want to extend my thanks to Thomson Reuters Special Services for sponsoring this event, as well as our latest research on this topic. Those who follow CSIS's work closely may be familiar with the Center's work in recent years on the gray zone, that often murky space that exists between routine statecraft and conventional warfare. This work has analyzed how and why actors like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea are increasingly operating in that space between peace and war to achieve asymmetric advantage and pursue their strategic interests. As we and many others have pointed out, this behavior is nothing new. Asymmetry has been a pillar of warfare for millennia, but these activities are being carried out in a world that's increasingly multipolar, and they're being enabled by a host of emerging and disruptive technologies. These trends are introducing new risks and challenges to U.S. efforts to identify, warn, confront, and deter these behaviors. Over the last year, CSIS has also expanded its work analyzing the future of the intelligence mission, and this work is focused on the importance of IC digital transformation and innovation and the need to confront a scale and complex threats. Our latest research is a convergence of these two lines of efforts, and it's reflected in the brief we're launching that I co-authored with Riley McCabe, entitled Detect and Understand, Modernizing Intelligence for the Gray Zone. What do we find in this study? The most important thing is probably to just recognize that the gray zone exists along a spectrum of intensity. If you start looking at the high end of that spectrum, things like Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, activities in the South China Sea, or even what we're seeing right now on the eastern border with Ukraine. From an intelligence perspective, you can see this behavior and recognize that it's a threat. And there's always going to be some uncertainty in trying to predict a state's true intentions. But ultimately, the problem and the challenge at that high end falls on policymakers to determine how to confront and deter behavior. And sometimes the failure is of warning, and that it's delivered only once an actor's pursuit and its efforts are irreversible. In this study, we focused a lot on the low end of the spectrum, trying to discern between something that could normally be characterized as legitimate geopolitics and something that could be characterized as hostile. Looking in this space is essential for warning, but from an intelligence perspective, it's not very helpful to draw stark lines between the benign and the malign, because it's all important to informing the picture of what intelligence is trying to do, which is deliver insights to policymakers. This is why, as we proceeded through our analysis, we started thinking through and coalescing around these two concepts that we characterize as detect and understand, which are really just fundamental intelligence missions. Ultimately, we need to synthesize activities across the gray zone spectrum, and that's what detect and understand is all about. And when we use these terms, detect and understand, what we're meaning is the need to identify gray zone activities as they emerge, detect, and contextualize them within a broader understanding of what the actor's strategy and intentions are. Understand fundamental intelligence responsibilities. But the way that the gray zone is evolving really challenges them. The pace of threats, short decision cycles, and ambiguities around the actions, intentions, and strategy of adversaries requires that the synchronization and synthesizing of these detect and understand components. They need to be constantly informing each other in real time. They're not sequential. And time and knowledge gaps can lead to overemphasis on one at the expense of the other, and this introduces serious risks of miscalculation or intelligence failure. So as we proceeded, we started diagnosing the specific challenges associated with each of these functions, detect and understand. And as we looked at detect in the gray zone and in the security environment, there were two main takeaways. One is the challenge of weak signals, which is a concept that's been advanced in other CSIS work. But it's basically that ambiguity of behavior in the gray zone and how hard it is to identify and contextualize and parse through when it's overlaid with things like misinformation and disinformation. What we also found is another concept that we refer to as unfamiliar signals, which is that a lot of the information that needs to inform indications and warning work in the intelligence world is emerging from outside of traditional focuses of intelligence collection. This is particularly looking at things like social media, private cybersecurity vendors, and other private sector sources of information, and obviously the ongoing revolution in the area of open source intelligence, information and analysis. On the understand side, there's two big pieces. One is attribution, and we mean attribution in the traditional sense from a cyber perspective, which is sometimes it's just hard to know who it was that was responsible for undertaking a particular activity. But the attribution can also be hard in attributing what the actual threat level is associated with an action, saying this action is concerning, but what threat does it present? That can be really challenging, particularly as we look at that low end of the spectrum. And then overarching is this idea of aggregation. And we don't just mean aggregation and comparing like-for-like activities in the same region, but looking at integrated campaigns across space, across time, and across domains, and how challenging that is in this space. So as we proceeded in developing the recommendations in support of this report, the focus was on generating real-time synchronization between those detect and understand functions, and looking at where technology can assist, and technology can definitely be an enabler in this space, but the gray zone is fundamentally an exercise in managing uncertainty and ambiguity, and those are human functions. So the recommendations that we put forth progress from ways the IC can leverage technology to increase its access to diverse data, tools to get through that data, and different types of analysis even from outside the intelligence community. We overlay those with additional structural, organizational, and cultural reforms that are intended to improve how intelligence officers assess behavior, manage uncertainty, and collaborate with a wide range of stakeholders and communicate with policymakers. So I hope everyone has an opportunity to review the report. There's 6 recommendations specifically, and they're laying out sort of some of the ways that the IC can harness technology and introduce modest reforms that hopefully get analysts in the place where they need to be focused on managing the complexity and uncertainty in the gray zone. And with that, it is my honor to hand the microphone over to Dr. Vickers to share his insights on where the intelligence mission needs to go to navigate current challenges. And he's a true legend in the intelligence and special operations community and needs little introduction, but I will just say after distinguished service and leadership in the US Army and CIA, Dr. Vickers served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict from 2007 to 2011. And then as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence from 2011 to 2015. Thank you again for being with us today, sir, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Jake, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here today. So I commend the report. I think the 2 fundamental tasks of detect and then understand really captures well the problem in this area short of conventional war, which we call the gray zone. And report also contains several interesting recommendations. So what I'm going to talk about today are really 3 topics. First, what is the gray zone and what's its scope and how does that apply to intelligence? And then why do we need to modernize intelligence to deal with this particular challenge? And then finally, how should we modernize intelligence to deal with it? So let me first talk about the term and the scope that it entails. So let me say up front, I don't like the term gray zone. I think it came about a few years ago to deal with things like China building fake islands in the South China Sea to project their power, and it meant a certain group of military activities, but really, I don't have a good term to replace it, but it's really all measures short of conventional war that strategic competitors use to try to gain advantage over their adversaries and global advantage, and it includes really a wide range of tools that I'll talk about it. So, like the Potter-Stewart rule about one of our famous Supreme Court justices about, what is pornography? You know it when you see it. I think that applies to the gray zone too. We certainly understand its components. My good friend and colleague Seth Jones here at CSIS has recently written a great book that I highly recommend called 3 Dangerous Men. My only beef with it, so is Valery Gerasimov, the Russian, the late Qasem Soleimani, Iranian, and Zhang Shaw, vice chairman of the Central Military Commission in China. My only beef with it is how come there wasn't an American as a fourth danger? We need to be dangerous too, so particularly to our adversaries. But he uses the term irregular warfare, which I have a little bit of experience with. And I think that is stretching it beyond the bounds too. He includes espionage and other things in there. Support for state or non-state actors, and economic coercion that are beyond the traditional definitions of irregular warfare. But his scope is exactly right. Another term we use, I spent a lot of my career in, is covert action, or the so-called third option between diplomacy and military force. Well, again, that's one component of this set of all measures short of war, but not the only one. But again, it tried to capture this notion between traditional and more competitive or adversarial. So what is the scope then? Well, its aim is influence or advantage. Covert action deals with non-lethal and then progresses up to lethal. I spent more time on the lethal side of the business. And so do these activities. So at the lower end, you have information influence, and then economic coercion and other forms of influence beyond the information age. Information influence, whether covert or overt, is really in a golden age now because of a lot of the new tools that are available, because of globalization, and be able to project power like you really couldn't do in the Cold War in the information age. And then the polarization of a lot of societies that make more fertile audiences for this. So this is a powerful tool, as we saw to our regret in the 2016 and to a lesser extent in the 2020 presidential elections, and we'll see more of it. Technology is really getting better with things like deepfakes. Post-truth, I think, was an Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year a few years back, and sort of sums up the world we live in now. Now, to try to give this some coherence, there's a concept going around now about cognitive warfare, or the war for minds that takes place across the spectrum too. Chinese are really big believers in this, going back to Sun Tzu, and I believe we're in a cognitive war competition in a lot of ways. As we get more into the intelligent machine age, you'll start seeing algorithmic warfare, where computers try to fake out and outsmart other computers as well. And all part of this, this will transcend the gray zone or short of conventional war, and like cyber, progress up through the spectrum of conflict, but will be very relevant in this area, as control of the narrative is a key problem for policymakers now. And then turning to the more lethal side of these activities, the advances in precision targeting, a lot of which come from open source intelligence, has enabled a thing I call identity warfare, which is targeting individuals to harass them or to do less pleasant things against them. I know where you live, I know where your family lives, you may not want to do this, etc. And that precision targeting with advances in revolution in biotechnology extends to the bio realm, not just the information realm as well. And then there's strategic sabotage. One of our central competitions in this new strategic competition, new Cold War, whatever we're calling it, great power competition with China and Russia. One of the central competitions is economic and technological competition with China, and then this information influence with both China and Russia that we're engaged in. So that naturally lends itself to supply chain interdiction, sabotage of various sorts to try to gain advantage in that. It's something we do with a lot of instruments, restricting technology abroad, but there's also a more active component to that. And then like our old Cold War, there's proxy and indirect conflict. Great powers tend not to fight each other because of the escalation risk, particularly to nuclear warfare, and so that leaves a lot of room for conventional war against other states or other forms of aggression against great powers, as we saw in 2014 in Ukraine and we may be seeing now in terms of a great power against a non-great power. You know, in the trends since the 1980s in technology have really been favoring insurgents. You know, I capitalized on that when I was a CIA officer supporting the Afghan resistance against the Red Army in Afghanistan. And the ability to do standoff attacks and a range of other things is just emboldened or certainly enabled insurgents pretty dramatically. And then as Gerasimov talks about, there's a blurring of war and peace. You know, the Chinese and Russians in their strategic doctrine tend to think that they're really at war with us all the time. It's just a lesser form of conflict. And I think that's exactly right. Another thing you have to worry about in this realm as you get up toward the lethal end, or it actually breaks out into open warfare, is covert preparation for warfare. A lot of things you do in this so-called gray zone or all measures short of war, planning things in information systems so you can do a cyber attack against an electrical power grid or something else, have a big impact on shaping the actual conventional war, not just winning a Cold War competition short of war, but potentially giving you really first mover advantage in a conflict. And then another thing that makes this sort of unique today is this blurring of public and private. You know, you have a lot of private actors, some sponsored by governments, but some tolerated by governments or doing it on their own. And cybercrime is one example of this, and you know, where they're based sometimes may indicate something, but they're also independent actors to a degree. And so you have a commingling of, the state certainly doesn't have a monopoly on some of these activities. So you know, again, so this is all measures short of war. It's a serious competition. It's covert action plus lots of other things. So let me turn now to why we should care about this, why we want to make sure our intelligence organizations or communities are adapted to this kind of competition. And three reasons for that. The first is something we deal with in the military all the time. What's our enemy's most likely course of action versus what's their most dangerous course of action? So this one is clearly in the most likely camp, and it's plenty dangerous on its own. Again, for the reason that great powers tend to be deterred to have large-scale conventional wars due to the risk of escalation and certainly strategic wars. And so like the Cold War, the escalation risk incentivizes actors, or great powers, to do this. But it also incentivizes others as well. All our adversaries pursue asymmetric approaches, tools that we would put in this gray zone category. So whether you're Iran with its malign influence, or North Korea, or the global jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and whoever else joins the club, they don't want to take the U.S. and its allies on in conventional war, and so they resort to asymmetric means, and so they're participants in this world too. It isn't just for great powers. And then, you know, since nuclear war hopefully remains unthinkable, even conventional war, I mean, I wouldn't rule out limited conventional wars between great powers, but because of the escalation risk, large-scale or decisive conventional war really seems difficult to imagine given sides can escalate unacceptably to the other side. And so therefore you have a declining utility of great power conventional war. We might fight over this thing or that thing for a brief period of time, but the threat of escalation will likely force war termination. So the second reason, besides being this the most likely avenue in the area where you're going to have to win this strategic competition, most likely, if you're going to prevail over your adversary, is, as the term gray implies, its opaqueness. You know, this is a little harder to detect and understand than conventional war is or strategic forces are. Hard in some cases to attribute what's going on. And then you have this challenge of unfamiliar or weak signals, unfamiliar meaning also new signals. Havana syndrome may be one example of that. You know, is that anomalous health incidents that just coincidentally happen to hit a lot of intelligence officers, or is it a means of covert attack that we don't yet understand? But if it is the latter, its implications are enormous. Its national security implications are enormous, and we need to get to the bottom of it. And then the final reason is it's consequential. I like to point, not surprisingly, to our Afghan program in the 1980s, only defeat the Red Army ever suffered in its history, played a role in bringing an end to the Soviet Empire and the Cold War. And so these things can have bigger impacts than you might see at first glance. Our support for solidarity during the Cold War also was a pretty big body blow at the Soviet Empire. 9/11 was clearly a major body blow to us, more American dead than at Pearl Harbor, and then the Russian interference in our elections. So to turn to my final topic then, how should we modernize? So I would answer it's some new capabilities, but really more exploiting ones we currently have, or planned ones that are coming down the pike. It's more about retargeting these capabilities and reprioritizing existing and planned ones than it is about building new ones. And I would argue it requires change in our intelligence structure across the spectrum, beginning with priorities. How much do we assign collection assets and analytical assets to this problem rather than other problems? You know, we tend to put more emphasis on military capabilities of our major adversaries or strategic intentions of their leadership, and obviously the intention spills over into this area. So we have a thing in the U.S. government called the National Intelligence Priorities Framework that sets priorities across a range of targets and by priority, and some of the things in this area, because they're hard to detect and because they're hard to understand and because it's the main thing, it's really the central competitive game, mandates a certain level of priority. So let me turn, and then I would add too, Jake kind of hinted at this, deterrence is almost non-existent in this world. You know, there are a few things you can deter, but unlike big conventional war or nuclear war where deterrence really does work, or even cyber war at the high end, doesn't work for cyber stuff at the lower end. And so it just goes on all the time and it can hurt you. So now let me turn to some of the INTs and intelligence disciplines, starting with collection. So in some cases, the challenge for collection is there's new battlegrounds that we have to focus on as you look at the spectrum of influence operations. There's or economic influence and the gains that can come from that. There, in some cases, would be new sources and new tools. So there's a lot of talk about open source intelligence, and it really is having a big impact on the world of intelligence. But there's almost a religious cult behind some of it, that it can replace secret forms of intelligence, and I certainly don't believe that. I think it can enable, it can complement our secret sources. It can enable some of them as well by bringing those tools to bear on those other realms, but it's not going to replace it. And so it just needs to be seen as another tool. It's also important to keep it decentralized rather than, some of our intelligence disciplines or INTs, as we call them, are the purview of a largely dominant agency. HUMINT for CIA, SIGINT for NSA, GEOINT for NRO and NGA. Everybody uses OSINT. Some use it for targeting, others use it to collect in areas where it's most efficient. And so it's important because it can support intelligence activities from the very compartmented to the benign, that it needs to remain decentralized. So what about the traditional sources then, and secret sources? So GEOINT will be very important for certain aspects of the gray zone activity. One of the features of our planned architectures, and this is related to OSINT as well as our traditional intelligence architectures, is we're going to know a lot more, or at least collect a lot more data about our adversaries than we ever have before. It's a function of persistence of our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. You know, without getting into detail, those coming down the road will let us see way more than we've seen in the past, and it'll be harder to deceive us in traditional ways. Deception will still have a pretty robust future, but you'll have to do new things to make it work. So we want to take advantage of that persistence. But we don't want to overdo it. We need to have a high-low mix. You know, just like for, you know, Al-Qaeda is in China, you need very different military and intelligence systems to deal with China than you do with Al-Qaeda. You know, things that can fly in benign airspace are very different than things that have to penetrate our most advanced air defenses. And you shouldn't make one size fits all, obviously. You shouldn't relegate yourself to standoff against the high-end threat, and you shouldn't insist that everything be gold-plated and able to function across the spectrum of challenges or conflict. Now let me turn to SIGINT and HUMINT, which I think will be particularly important, and SIGINT includes cyber. You know, there's open secrets and there's really closely guarded secrets, and this gray zone will have a mixture of both of those things, some of the most sensitive things, and then some that are a part of traditional international intercourse. One of the challenges, you know, the big challenge for SIGINT going forward is the proverbial risk of going dark, you know, because of new technologies that makes encryption difficult to break. The challenge for HUMINT is a thing we call ubiquitous technical surveillance, that with cameras and AI systems and all sorts of tracking mechanisms and cell phones, an adversary can wire their major cities to make anything anomalous stand out, and obviously that has implications for meeting agents and other things. It's something we're going to have to defeat. It also will likely be exported to other countries around the world as well, as, you know, if it's good for one authoritarian, it ought to be good for other authoritarians who want to control their dissidents, et cetera. So let me now turn to analysis. So one challenge is the need to look in new places. Our Russian interference in our 2016 election is a good example of that. You know, it wasn't that it was so hidden from us, so we didn't even look for a couple years at what was being done to us. And then there's the attribution challenge for certain areas where adversaries are taking steps to conceal. Cyber is a good example of that they may be hijacking servers in other places or doing other things. And then related to understanding, there's the context challenge, and particularly about these integrated campaigns. You know, in war, you're always looking back to Clausewitz, you know, how can I use the battle for the purpose of war? You know, or how do I use a string of battles in a campaign for the purpose of war? The same is true in this all measures short of war, is how am I integrating lots of instruments to achieve long-term ends, to either attrit my enemy or weaken my enemy or gain influence or advantage in some other areas. And I would add that warning in this area, just like often on the verge of conventional war, doesn't just emerge out of a bunch of facts. You know, it's not that I see A, B, C, D, and E, and so I say, therefore, this is happening. And the gray zone makes that particularly challenging. You know, I'm reminded again about Afghanistan. In 1979, we saw the Soviet buildup for months on the border. We saw them mobilizing reserves. We saw the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan, Russians going to combat advisors. CIA still didn't think the Russians were going to invade because they thought it was stupid. You know, we wouldn't do it, so why would they? And of course they did. We provided some tactical warning to policymakers, President Carter at the time, right before the invasion, but that was it. Same may be true today for Russia on the border of Ukraine. You know, we think it's stupid to do it. That doesn't mean he won't do it. And then the report highlights some of these new tools, AI and machine learning or modeling, to try to make sense of some of these campaigns. And then another area that's not really the purview exclusively of intelligence, but is very important, something the Pentagon has worked on for years, is net assessment. You know, in any competition, you don't want to just know what your adversary is doing, but how are you doing in competing with that adversary? Intelligence community has been wary of getting in on that because that means assessing the U.S. or in other cases, you know, our own government. But it's essential to make sense of these competitions, and we ought to think about how we do that. Now, these assessments, given the nature of the competition, are likely to be very different from those we did in the Cold War, which were military balance assessments and military burden sharing and other things, but there's no shortage of them. And then I would add, you know, as is often the case, we're in an asymmetric competition in this area just because of the democracy, authoritarian competition, and others. And so it poses unique challenges in that regard, too. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention covert action, my favorite topic. That isn't going away. It'll be applied against new problems as well as some traditional ones as well. And we better be good at it, and that requires some modernization of tools as well. So let me conclude by talking about intelligence and policy. Roberta Wohlstetter, in her famous book, emphasized that not just the thing that everybody remembers about signals to noise ratio and everything else, but the relationship between warning and decision. You know, we have a phrase that we like to say, number one, there's only two conditions in the world: policy success and intelligence failure. But it's not really true, right? I mean, and so the other thing we like to say is that as intelligence officers is the danger of just admiring the problem, a policymaker admiring the problem. You know, they're warned about it, they understand it, but they don't know what the appropriate action to take is, and so you do nothing. And you know, that's the case before 9/11 and many other incidents in our history that we then, it's not that we don't have intelligence failures, we do, but we also have plenty of policy failures, and they usually come from admiring the problem rather than doing something about it. But to do something about it, you got to detect it, and you got to understand it, and then you got to do something about it. With that, I'll conclude.
Well, we have an in-person audience, so we can at least give a round of applause and thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we'll start off with the conversation now, and since I'm the moderator, I get the prerogative of the first question. You laid out just, you know, articulately all of the complexity of this environment that U.S. policymakers are trying to navigate, and laid out some really important areas where the IC needs to modernize, you know, its collection, its analysis, its activities, but and weaving in, importantly, you know, analysis on one side and then the IC's unique role in covert action on the other, which obviously is really a cornerstone of your career. But so if you were a policymaker, again, back, you know, in the government, what do you need from the IC right now? What is it that the IC can deliver to help that decision dilemma that is emergent from these types of activities?
You know, so as I said, and policymakers share this since they control the NIPIF, the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, but it's making sure we have adequate resources, you know, commensurate with the threat or the centrality of this part of the competition, and that we understand its many dimensions and scope. Again, that there's, you know, and it's a tough choice of what are you going to give up to do this, but that's the first thing, and then it's really developing the capabilities and subject to that reprioritization to target some of these things. You know, so for instance, the Havana syndrome is one example. You know, I can think of not too many more important issues right now to get to the bottom of. And so, you know, you would use traditional assets against that, SIGINT and HUMINT and other things, but you know, if that really is state-sponsored, it's a very closely guarded secret. And you know, there's other ways of detecting that kind of activity too. But so that would be one, and then developing capabilities for areas that are outside the traditional IC's purview, influence rated to economic coercion or exploitation of technology that's associated with exports and economic advancement and other things that we may just not be collecting enough on or have the right tools, because that's not something you necessarily steal the secret with one of our traditional secret stealing tools. So it's making sure we can cover the spectrum of this, and that we have analysts focusing on understanding integrated campaigns, not just the eaches.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's something that we obviously diagnosed as we were writing through this report. It's just the importance of delivering, you know, complex analysis that can inform decision making better, because it seems, you know, you laid out again the diversity and scale of threats that are global, and that trap of problem admiring, which can, you know, challenge decision making in any policy standpoint, particularly ones like these where escalation dilemmas are real. You know, as we look at all of these, you know, we could say all these awful things happening or bad things happening that we see all over the world, how does the IC get out of the trap where it may be delivering warning fatigue to policymakers, where all they're doing is continuing to deliver the bad news that this economic coercion is happening in this part of the world, and we're seeing more cyber activities here, and we're seeing all of these, and we're seeing more, you know, covert action here. How does the IC sort of escape that dynamic if that's a challenge?
Well, that is a challenge, right? Because policymakers, you know, come to office because they want to do something. They want to do something positive, you know, and to make the world better or something. And, you know, you being the skunk at the garden party all the time, telling them that the world's messier than you think and you're being attacked here, here, and here, and, you know, is not necessarily welcome news. You know, and then you compound that then with incomplete intelligence or signal to noise or unfamiliar threats. You know, I mean, that, you know, that kind of characterizes the run-up to 9/11, you know, to some degree. I mean, on one hand, we didn't really have actionable intelligence, but we had a stream of strategic intelligence saying, they're coming after us, they've done this twice, they're plotting something big, it's any day now. We just didn't know the how or the exact when or something else. But imagine yourself as a policymaker where, okay, if you really told me, and again, this is admiring the problem till you get exquisite intelligence, and sometimes we do, but the world always doesn't lend itself to that, you know. And so it's that policy intelligence problem is something that I think is not, you know, what's the limits of intelligence in a lot of cases that you have to face up to if you're a policymaker, you know. So for instance, in counterterrorism sometimes, you know, you may not exactly know who a given terrorist is, but you know they're definitely a terrorist and they're plotting or something. And so is that a good enough basis to take action against them? Several presidents of ours have decided that it was. Turned out to be the right answer and quite precise. But it, you know, it mirrors policy with what intelligence can do. And, you know, there is a tendency to just wait. And there is a danger here of fatigue. You know, how often do you have the risk of major conventional war? Or you really think you're on the verge of nuclear war versus this when, you know, some things not so grave, other things maybe a little worse are happening all the time to you.
I'd like to open up to the room if anybody wants to ask a question, although I have plenty more from our online audience. Anybody? Right behind you. Actually, if you could just step up to the microphone. Yeah. Right behind you. Awesome.
Thanks, Jake. Michael, thank you very much. Mark Jacobson, I'm the Assistant Dean for Washington Programs at the Maxwell School, former Huminter and former Solic alumni, or a Solic alumni as well. You know, I was glad to hear you mention this issue of net assessment, because when I, you know, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, and I think about what can the Russians do and what can we do to stop it, I'm not actually worried about our capability. I want to know what's happening in the minds of the Ukrainians on the ground. So whether it's the Baltics or Ukraine, understanding how resilient these countries are, what their local police capability is like, how they're really going to act, who's vulnerable to corruption. And while I think there's a role for the for the IC, there are much better sources of information in the U.S. government. And the challenge is, how do you get to the USAIDs and Department of Commerce? How do you get to the nonprofits and the implementing partners without compromising their integrity? But there are ways, but and some of it, frankly, isn't for discussion in a public forum, but I worry that when we look at our capability to understand, we're not focusing on the resiliency of our allies, nor on the better situational awareness and even specificity on the ground that some of the other non-IC organizations in the U.S. government have. And I'd just be curious how you may see this. And Jake, whether you all considered this in terms of the report.
Sure, Mark. Well, that's a terrific question. One that touches on kind of paying attention to new information or new sources in the corruption case you were talking about. So if you look at Russian actions in Ukraine, right? I mean, it's clearly important to them. But after the Orange Revolution, they went the political action route of co-opting oligarchs and doing other things to get their guy elected. And that's how they put the genie back in the bottle. Later they went to combination of subversion in eastern Ukraine and then a blend of unconventional and conventional warfare to achieve their aims. Everybody focuses on Crimea as the first action. It wasn't. And then now they may be doing yet a different thing with who knows what broader objectives. So you raise a couple of important issues about, if that's the chessboard, understanding the board, if you will, or some of the other pieces that aren't ours or our adversaries is very important in terms of resiliency, in terms of susceptibility to influence, a range of things. So, Putin's goal has long been to weaken, if not break up NATO. And so this may just be one instrument toward that end. Ukraine's nice. It would be nice to have better control over it from his perspective. But the real objective may be more than that. And understanding that is very important for deterrence and others. So you raise lots of good points, particularly when you're talking about economic coercion or information influence. I think not only were we not looking in the right places before 2016, we really failed to appreciate why, I don't know, but just how vulnerable our society was to this kind of stuff. Now that polarization had been going on for 20 years. I mean, every time you turned on the TV, you couldn't miss it. But yet, if we really had understood the situation we would find ourselves in up to 2016 and after it, our political leaders might have taken some steps in the past 20 years to try to do something about it.
Yeah, and just following up on your question about the report, one of the key findings in here is the need to diversify access to data, and that includes data on the ground and forward operating environments to have better insights into what's happening, diversity of insights and analytics, so being able to bring in diverse perspectives. That's this idea that geopolitical forecasting tools that integrate public and private partners can be really valuable in this space. But what's really valuable about those in a lot of circumstances is not necessarily that just the different perspectives that are coming in, but different techniques that people share that look at different problem sets. So I maybe have looked at this hard, challenging, integrated gray zone issue involving this threat actor, and here's how I approach the problem, and I achieve this net positive outcome. Maybe me looking at a different actor and threat set can learn how to translate those same techniques into new innovative ways to look at complex threats. So partnerships and diversity are absolutely at the core of this.
And to relate this back to the traditional IC, one of the challenges in assessing covert action, because it's done by intelligence services, is we tend to see it as kind of a counterintelligence problem. What's that service doing, rather than what's its strategic effect? You know, and you have a similar problem in human. You know, if you're focusing all the time on how 10 feet tall your counterintelligence adversary is, you're not going to recruit any spies. And you're really ships passing in the night. You know, both services are not going after each other. They do, but they also go after lots of other targets, right? And if you're too focused just on that other service, you're missing the bigger picture and opportunities. And that's I think, particularly true in covert action.
Thanks again for coming today. My colleague Jim Lewis and I have an ongoing debate about whether or not it is likely or even possible for activity in the cyber domain to escalate into what we think about as conventional warfare. And that seems very relevant to this larger discussion about gray zone. The reason that people turn to covert action is because they want it to be deniable. They want it to not escalate into more conventional warfare. So could you say a little bit about the limits of covert action, and then also what you think the probability is of some of these tactics escalating into what we think of as open war?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you have to separate, in a lot of cases, the tool from the spectrum of conflict. So cyber, for example, is something that is applicable across the spectrum of conflict. You know, it goes from espionage to attack, but it also can be used as a tool of strategic warfare at the high end, you know, to cripple a society so much that you're a homeland of your adversary that has nuclear weapons-like effects, so shutting off a power grid or something else of that nature to cause lots of misery. And it can have irritant effects, you know, distributed denial of service attacks and other things. It can be used in conventional war to attack enemy radar systems, you know, rather than sending a missile against them to disable them that way. What is different about it is, one, the severity of the attack as you go from DDS attacks to something that might be crippling to a homeland, and something in the middle that's part of a war that's just another tool, another bomb that you're using against a range of targets, but also the overtness and the objective of it. You know, if we're in a war, a conventional war, and our homeland suffers a massive cyber attack, we're not going to be under any illusions about who did it to us and then think about how we might respond at that appropriate level. What we do with the daily intercourse of things that a private actor does it, you know, with Colonial Pipeline, or the distributed denial of service attacks that the Iranians and others have done against us, you know, is a fundamentally different problem. I think that, you know, and so in the one case, in the gray zone, the aim of these things is different too. So in the gray zone, you know, the effort, like all irregular warfare, as a nod to Seth there, is to attrit and to weaken the will over time. You know, in strategic warfare, the aim may be war termination. You know, look, I'm in danger of losing this conventional war, so I'm going to move up the escalation ladder to raise your pain to get you to stop. And there's no doubt about who's doing it. I'm even going to tell you I'm doing it, and I hurt you, but you know, the aim is different as well. So some of these tools not only span the spectrum, but they have very different aims depending on where they're employed and how they're employed. Same could be true for biological sabotage, you know, things you would do you know, against crops or something else, maybe to weaken an adversary over time, is different than, you know, and again, you face an attribution danger there versus what you might do in war. So I'm getting all the tough guy questions now. I thought Emily was it, you know. No.
Seth Jones from CSIS. There has been some news about the possibility of DIA now becoming the lead U.S. Government agency for open source intelligence that the Wall Street Journal reported over the weekend. And the question is not about that per se, but about what your thoughts are on how better the intelligence, the U.S. and even allied intelligence communities can use open source information. It's clearly very different from even the era that you started your career off in the Cold War, where we've got commercial satellite imagery now, commercial SIGINT collection. We've got a whole range of data sets that companies have access to. So the question is how well do you think the IC is using open source, and how does it better figure out how to deal with it in ways that are helpful and get around some of the legal problems that have been raised as well?
Yeah, so I don't think creating a new open source agency, given that everybody uses it and they, in some cases, use it for compartmented purposes, would be the right idea. And because also it's like replicating NSA on some level. I'm going to need, since open source stretches across a wide range of problems, I'm going to need economic analysts and this kind of analyst and that kind of analyst, as well as collectors specializing in various targets and everything else. And unlike, there's a skill to open source collection, but again, it really needs to be applied to the specific problem. And so it's not like SIGINT, where you really need lots of people do SIGINT, but NSA is our dominant SIGINT agency. It's because they've got the repository of the most sophisticated capabilities. Or CIA with human, same thing. They develop the best tradecraft and everything. And so I think open source is fundamentally different in that regard. It's important, don't get me wrong, but I would not favor giving that mission to DIA or creating a new agency. CIA technically is the leader of the open source enterprise, used to be called Open Source Center, along with Human. It also tends to get, as a big enterprise, it tends to be ghettoized and neglected within individual agencies. And so I'd worry about other missions and other things. So it's it's to be continued. And I'll just leave aside the many, as you touch on SIGINT and others, the legal challenges. But open, though, is open. That's one of the benefits.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Vickers. Thank you very much for your remarks, and also to Jake and the team for a cracking report. You've mentioned, I'm Sean Monaghan. I'm the UK Visiting Fellow here at CSIS. Hello. And I have two questions, if I may be greedy. The first one is about uncertainty, which you've touched on a little bit, and the report rather majors on. And I wonder, you've identified the problem of kind of non-linear warning signals. Everything is possibly a threat. Everything's possibly a target. What specific advice would you give to the analytical community and the decision-maker community? And is there a kind of change in mindset required here? There's this quote, I think it's attributed to John Maynard Keynes, it's about it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I wonder if that's a kind of mindset change that's required. Secondly, on allies and partners, if I may, diversity of threats will require more integration and cooperation with allies and partners. What do you think of the state of the relationship between the US intelligence community and allies and partners? Obviously, the UK and the US have a special relationship when it comes to intelligence. Is there more to be done on the allies and partners front, do you think? Thank you.
Sure. So first on the uncertainty part, raising the priority for intelligence focused on this area of competition, making sure we have coverage across the important areas, and then we have analysts focusing not only on the individual areas, but on what does this really mean in the aggregate across, and even net assessments about integrated campaigns, I think is important, and it helps reduce uncertainty. You still have the problem of, since this is another version of death by 1,000 cuts, the one cut doesn't hurt too much, and so you still have the problem of policymaker fatigue and where am I in this competition and should I do anything about it? And that just isn't going away, no matter how good the IC gets at dealing with these various things. Now, if it's a bad enough lethal covert action, in some narrow area, it may rise. The closer you get to hostilities, the more you may do something about it. But influence and other things, this is just, the ocean. It's just there all the time. And so it is a warning challenge and a pay attention to me challenge. Allies and partners are, it's a great strength of the United States that we rely on allies for our national security. The Global Counterterrorism Network was critical, made up of allies and partners for disrupting a lot of plots that in so many countries. Resiliency is a problem in a lot of these areas, whether cyber resiliency or Mark referenced susceptibility to other forms of influence. And so that's, again, if you start with the central competitions of this strategic competition, economic and technological with China, and influence in a variety of forms and using a variety of instruments with China and Russia, that suggests a very different purpose of what you want your allies and partners for, just as if the war after 9/11 was very different than what we wanted them for in the Cold War. And so, how you harness like-minded countries for technological competition or make them resilient against all these forms of influence is maybe more important, because they're not in danger necessarily of, most of them aren't at least, in terms of conventional attack or other things. And so, but your alliance system could get whittled away. So, if you look at the Russian threat to Europe today, it's on its periphery. The idea of Soviet tanks, ending up on the English Channel, Russian tanks today, I guess I should say, it shows how old I am, is not very likely. But undermining Europe's cohesion and will through a variety of these gray zone activities is within their purview, and they're really working on it. And as long as they bust up NATO, I don't think they care how they do it or weaken it. And same thing for our homelands. So, but I think it starts with really understanding what the threat is, and then how do I make these partners resilient against those threats.
And there's one question that we received online that I would love to ask you before we wrap up here, as we're growing short on time. But you made, I think underlying all this conversation, you mentioned in your remarks, is the importance of humans in really cutting through some of the ambiguity and issues in this area. And then you mentioned the ubiquitous technical surveillance and the challenges around UTS to future humans. But here's the question: is, as authoritarian counterintelligence efforts benefit from UTS, how do democracies keep up without abandoning their values of freedom and openness?
Yeah, so that's one aspect of the asymmetric nature of the competition, right? But we also had that in the Cold War. And so, what it means is, we may have to work 10 times harder to collect valuable intelligence in China and Russia than they do in the United States. But, one of the lessons I took away from the Cold War when I was a CIA officer and fighting the Red Army was, 1985 was the year of the spy for us. So one, we were doing really well in the late Cold War against the Soviet Empire in terms of human, but as we later found out to our sorrow, they were doing very well against us, and it wiped out a lot of our large stuff. But as I reflected on it, as we had great success in Afghanistan and the Cold War was coming to an end, I thought, okay, so at the end of the day, we won the covert action war. We won the big battle, and then we beat them in other places too. The espionage war might have been a draw, but we won the Cold War. But I thought, so if it was a draw, what else can you take out of it? And one of the things I concluded was, some of our agents were the elite of the Soviet system. They were the best, they were the people privileged from the system. And so when they betray it, it tells you one thing. And our traitors tended to be skunks. you know, and so if you just look at it on that basis, not the measure of what did you get, because that's important too, you know, how bad was the betrayal, but basically why are they betraying it and who's betraying it and what does it say about the strength of the two societies waging this broad Cold War struggle. I think it said something good about the West. You know, not that we didn't get our rear end handed to us a lot in espionage in Europe and you know, even here in the United States. But I think, and so I think the same is true potentially going forward. So yes, UTS is a tough problem and it's something we'll apply a lot of means to. And it is very asymmetric in a sense that they have advantages in this area, but hopefully we'll prevail like we did in the Cold War.
Well, that's an outstanding way to wrap up our discussion today. Dr. Vickers, thank you so much for
Sure.
joining us, and we'll give you one more round of applause. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Have a good afternoon.